is in truth a very careful process, uh, and one which is marked and distinguished from all other contending processes. First of all, by the fact that it's introduced in a finished state. We don't set about purportedly fixing our problems by addressing something that we have just given some attention, which in truth is in fact careless and casual. It's only when we have actually accounted for all of the relevant, inseparable matters at hand that we have a solution. And so, what distinguishes a proposition of solution from anything else is its refined, finished state. That is, it is distinguishable from all the rest of any other possible proposition by the recognizable fact that it is a solution, that it and it alone, usually, solves the matters at hand. We recognize it ourselves, and we can support it ourselves only by candid, unprejudiced evaluation. We subject this proposition to any and every test to which it should be subjected, and which its original author would have subjected it to conclusively even, before we support it. We don't run off and say, well, that doesn't sound good to us. Well, it doesn't sound like something that can be accomplished, without even evaluating the whole of it to see, well, indeed, in fact, not only is it accomplishable, it's readily accomplishable. It's the only thing that which can be accomplished. And so this matter of representation is one where an intelligent people tend always, rather than to divide, to splinter off into however many different directions, they unite. And they unite by a careful process of responsible evaluation of the matters at hand. If we don't do this, what we have is failed experiment after failed experiment, with all the injustices which these failed experiments sow. They sow from the very proposition that we divide upon, because in that proposition and in modeling that proposition by this obligatory process of careful evaluation, we realize how the experiment will fail, how in fact it's a poor experiment. When we find a flaw in anything, it's our obligation to rectify that flaw. It isn't to say, oh, today we came up with a new idea. This morning we woke and there it was. We have a need act, or another person over here woke this morning and said, oh, competing currencies will somehow solve our monetary aberrations. It's not for us to jump up and down in front of the rest of us and say, well, this is a solution. I just believe it will happen somehow. It's our obligation whenever we present any proposition to a republic or a democracy to qualify that proposition. That is to say, to prove that, first of all, its objects are of the common good. What is the object of a monetary system, in other words? Should be the primary goal of each of these propositions. The next thing which is obligatory for us to do is to prove that the means that we are proposing of accomplishing that object indeed accomplish it. If any of us can invalidate the proposition on any of those grounds, then it is the responsibility of all of us to recognize the flaw, because after all, our failure to do so subjects the rest of us to the flaw and its consequences. Now, this isn't asking a lot. It's asking what we have to give if we are to succeed as a republic. That is, if people are indeed fit to govern themselves, or to even to attest to a fact of actual representation. It's our failure to meet this standard which has resulted in our present difficulties. So as we all know in the course of our own lives, whenever we contemplate the nature of reality, we find that conflicting propositions for accomplishing a finite object in fact mean that at most one of the propositions can be right. The only possible enumeration of however many such conflicting propositions can be right results in either one state or another. That is, at most one is right or none are right. And the only way that we determine either of these possible facts is by this careful process of evaluation. And after all, as is the case whenever we engineer anything, this is the least work, in fact, that we can do to achieve our common objects. In other words, if each and every one of us doesn't understand how a prospective monetary system might or might not accomplish objects which are indispensable to all of us, we in fact commit a crime against the rest of us, because we compromise the integrity of representation, which is the most vital thing in a republic. Of course, then, this obligation to certify representation in the means and objects, in the qualification of the means and objects of common rule is vital to this proposition of absolute consensual representation. That is, whether we recognize it or not, it is our obligation to each other to properly validate that any proposition serves the common good of all. Not just best, but perfectly, if, in fact, perfectly is achievable. So the means to invalidate any proposition are incumbent upon any just set of laws or any just constitution of a righteous republic. And in those indispensable provisions for absolute consensual representation, then, we must have means for even an individual's invalidation of means or objects to prevail for the common good of all, at least by the assent of those who are so responsible as to recognize the prevailing arguments which will achieve the common objects of all. Well, it may be the right of some or even many, if not most of us, to deviate from that, to be subject ourselves to the consequences of our own irresponsibility. It is not our right, however, to subject the rest of humanity, however few, to the injustices of our irresponsibility. And so inevitably, when and if a republic ever evolves to a state where it recognizes that its laws must be in fact proofs of justice, we must too then recognize that a right of a sovereign individual exists to be free of offenses or injustice, in other words, as might be wrought by the responsibility of as much as the entire remainder of society. Now, Thomas Jefferson in particular wrote much about the possibilities, or probabilities if you will, of unjust majorities inflicting injustice upon a minority. And he likewise then observed that it is always the obligation, if law is to be determined by majorities, it is always the obligation of the ostensible majority, which in fact we rarely even have today. It is the obligation of the majority to recognize the rights of minorities, and even therefore individuals, to be free of offense inflicted by whatever the decisions of a majority. Now today, in fact, when we pass laws, we rarely subject them to public affirmation. So we can't say that we have absolute consensual representation. In fact, the naked purposes for insulating the actions of government are blatantly obvious. So obvious that we can readily understand why purported laws are not subject to public affirmation. After all, a party such as the 1912 Democrat Party can run for office on a platform promising not to create a central bank, and turn around and immediately set into motion all the devices to create a central bank. If such a proposition then were subject to public affirmation, not as a matter of inadvertent course, but a matter of